you ever wonder where all of your energy went? Are you struggling to maintain a healthy weight even though you are conscious of what you eat? Lack of energy is the most common complaint seen by Bev in her natural medicine practice today. The thyroid gland is paramount in determining the idle at which our body runs. This idle can be turned down when the body perceives the need for conservation. In the audiovisual presentation entitled Thyroid Dysfunction, No Get Up and Go, Bev explains how many factors such as diet regimes, stress, and overall hormonal imbalance can profoundly impact thyroid activity.
So our next topic will be about thyroid dysfunction, and I like to call it no get up and go because typically that's in midlife health with women. That's how you feel, really lacking in energy, slogging through mud, and really just feeling not so great. So to start, I'd like to talk a bit about the types of things that are associated with feeling in optimum or vibrant health. So then we can take that and look as a contrast of how you feel in thyroid dysfunction and hopefully give you ways to segue out of that and have a path to feeling vibrant and feeling as healthy as you can. So typically when I talk to people about their health, one of the very first things that they mention is energy. And I think that's the thing we all want more of, is lots of energy. If we're looking at a person walking down the street and we see them and think, wow, they're really in great health, one of the things that they'd probably have is a spring in their step. They're looking very vibrant in that their skin is really clear. They're of very good proportion as far as fat to muscle ratio. They're in optimum weight, and they're really just looking like they're in very good health. So energy is probably one of the first things to go, and is really a sign that our body is not functioning at its optimum to be able to do the everyday tasks that it needs to do in metabolism. Clear complexion is a very important part of it, and I think it's been a part of our tradition that with vibrant health is associated good skin because of our innate understanding of elimination, that if the liver and the kidneys and the digestive tract aren't working well, then you're going to see it in the skin. And that's really all of the mucous membranes will act that way. So the lungs may be not as clear. You may be clearing your throat a lot, having chronic asthma or allergies. Those kinds of things are associated with the lungs also having to extract more toxins out of the body than it should because the liver, the kidney, and the digestive tract aren't working as well. Sufficient sleep. So the optimum health person is hitting the pillow and falling asleep. And when they wake up, they feel rested. Okay, this is typical of optimum sleep. It's not necessarily the length of sleep that you have, but how good you feel when you wake up. So it's interesting that at the turn of the century that people were getting on average 10 hours sleep. And now we get on average about 6.5. And so clearly, I don't think that our sleep needs have decreased in our lives, but I think what is happening is that most people are living in sleep deficit. And this is a place, sleep is a place where you really regenerate and get your body back into health again. So to have a continuous sleep deficit can be over a long period of time very critical to your health. Regular bowel movements are very important, and also even mood patterns. This is sort of reflective of being in vibrant health because really if your nervous system is working properly, you should be able to handle stress, but then not absorb it, be able to get rid of it and resolve it in some way, and that your neurons are firing correctly and you're able to process things properly is all about sort of mood and good nervous system function. So that's kind of the picture of optimum health. Now, it'd be safe to say that probably most of the people in this room don't fit that picture, and most of the people that are walking around today don't fit the picture, and that's something that we all strive to get to. And I would even say that although people don't feel unhealthy, it's not until they start doing natural things and constitutional therapy that they think, hey, I can feel better than I have been. That, you know, your normal is what you feel like today, and it isn't until you start getting better that you realize how bad you've been feeling. So let's look at the thyroid. The thyroid is actually the largest endocrine organ in the body, and it sits at the neck, and it's kind of butterfly shape. It controls the rate of energy production by the cells. So this is a really key part of what the thyroid does, that metabolism is really all the chemical reactions in your body. So the thyroid is the ruler of how quickly those chemical reactions occur and how many occur throughout the day, depending on which mode it's in. Basically, what that does, in actual fact, is it controls your body temperature. So metabolism, because it takes energy and you release energy through chemical reactions, that your body temperature is very indicative of how well your thyroid is functioning. And over a period of a day, you'll have many micro changes in your temperature, but typically your temperature should remain fairly stable. And in women, there's obviously changes when you ovulate, and through the end of your period, there's changes in your temperature. When you ovulate, there's a real spike in temperature over the days that you're ovulating, but then really temperature should be pretty stable. The thyroid produces thyroxine, which is T4. That's 93% of its production. T4 is an inactive hormone. It doesn't have any function in the body. And it produces about 7% of T3, which is the active form of thyroxine. So what we're saying is that the thyroid produces the hormone, but it's really the precursor to the active hormone. Well, where is the active hormone produced? The thyroid produces the T4. It is actually translated into the active hormone in the liver. And so this is where liver health really becomes a very key part of thyroid health. So T4 in the thyroid turns into T3 in the liver, and then it's dispersed into the tissues and has its effect there. All the endocrine organs work in harmony with each other, and so we'll talk a little bit about each endocrine organ and see how in relationship they affect each other. In menopause, you'd think that the ovaries are really the only hormone that matters. And certainly when you're talking about hormones in the general public, most people think about reproductive hormones, estrogen and progesterone, but there's just so much more. The ovaries, when they're working, will produce estrogen and progesterone. And estrogen has a really profound effect on the body beyond the whole reproductive cycle. That does affect smooth muscle and whether it's tight or it's loose. It affects cholesterol production. It also helps with the absorption of calcium and other minerals into your bones. So there's a lot of things that estrogen does to affect the body. It also affects mood and the production of serotonin and melatonin and a bunch of brain chemicals. So it's a very important part of as who we are as women. Just as testosterone is a predominant hormone for men, it makes men who they are. The next endocrine organ we'll talk about are the adrenals. And the adrenals have a really big role to play in our bodies, although on a day-to-day basis, we're really not aware that they're even functioning. And certainly, going to regular medical practice, adrenals are very rarely talked about. They're the sort of forgotten endocrine organ. Unless there's extremes, there's Addison's disease where you don't make enough cortisol, and there's a series of symptoms associated with that. Or there's pheochromocytoma, which is a tumor on your adrenals, and then you're hyperstimulated and making too much cortisol. And so those are the two extremes. The medical profession really doesn't identify with anything in between. The adrenals are important in that it produces adrenaline and cortisol. And adrenaline is really important in that short bursts of response to things like bungee jumping, or you've been in a motor vehicle accident, you've had some kind of shock. That's your fight or flight response kicking into gear, your stress response. Okay. Cortisol is produced once adrenaline wears off. If the stress response still continues, then cortisol is produced. And its whole role in the body is to break down tissues into singular nutrients so that your body can have enough energy to escape. Okay? That's its prime directive, and it's the survival mechanism. Adrenals in women also produce testosterone, which is connected to libido, and another hormone called aldosterone. And this hormone is very key for fluid balance, so has a role to play in blood pressure, and also has a role to play in edema, or where you get sort of puffy hands or rings around your ankles. Those kinds of things are indications that you may have some imbalance in aldosterone. Now, the pancreas produces, in the islet cells, insulin. The rest of the pancreas actually produces enzymes, particularly fat enzymes, lipase, to break down fats in the digestive system. But the islet cells actually produce insulin, and this is all about sugar balance. Now, if you look at all these endocrine organs as a whole, in the 1930s, there was an endocrinologist who actually described how there was a feedback loop between all of these endocrine organs. And I think in general, because of our general reductionist approach to medicine, that this connection between all the organs has been forgotten about. Because certainly back in the 30s we knew it, but now there's not really talk about, especially in menopause, anything more than the reproductive hormones. But if you look at this whole picture, really the adrenals, I think in my opinion, have become the predominant organ, in that when you have stress, you're going to respond in a way that the adrenals take the lion's share of the base hormones to produce everything that it needs, so that the other organs will have to slow down and accommodate the adrenals for its needs. And when you think about it, that's our survival mechanism. So that's our very base mechanism that we have to deal with. Now, in menopause, when your ovaries stop making estrogen and progesterone, where do they go? Where are they produced? And the answer is the adrenals. So now not only do the adrenals have the job of making all the other hormones, but estrogen and progesterone are also having to be made by the adrenal glands. So if there's adrenal stress to begin with, before you go into menopause or even enter perimenopause, you can almost guarantee that during menopause you're going to have a heck of a time because of that increased load on the adrenal glands. Now let's look at the thyroid hormones and the different modes that the thyroid can go into. Normally, the thyroid will produce T4, and then the liver converts T4 into T3, the active hormone. It does that with an enzyme. It's 5'-deiodinase enzyme. This enzyme is produced in the liver as well. Now, when there's increased stress, the thyroid goes into what's called conservation mode. There's productivity mode, where it's working very well and it's producing T4, and the liver's producing this enzyme to effectively make T3. But once the thyroid goes into conservation mode, what happens from there is that it starts to decrease metabolism and lowers temperature. It does this because cellular metabolism, reactions that go on in the cells, and temperature are not critical to survival. Okay? So if we look at that stress response, everything we think about has to be, do we really need that to survive? And it doesn't matter if you're cold when you're running away from that axe murder, because you'll get over it. I mean, the whole idea of sympathetic response is that it's going to be short term. The fact of the matter is that our sympathetic response has been stuck on, and our bodies are having to continually cope with that reality. So what happens is metabolism goes down and we lower temperature. So this is where body temperature can really be an important part of assessing what the thyroid is doing. Now, when the thyroid is in conservation mode, instead of T4 being turned into T3 by this enzyme, a different enzyme is used. It's called 5-deiodinase. Now that sounds almost the same, but the other one is 5', whereas this one is 5-deiodinase. And basically, this enzyme is a lot easier for the liver to make. It takes a lot less energy. So when the body's in conservation mode, the liver will make this enzyme that's easier to make, and then what's produced is a thing called reverse T3. Reverse T3 has no activity in the body. So now instead of going from an inactive T4 to an active T3, you're going from an inactive T4 to an inactive reverse T3. So now you basically have no temperature control and metabolism control within the body. Studies have actually shown that newborns have really elevated levels of reverse T3. this makes sense because the whole process of birthing is very traumatic to the child. So they're in serious stress response mode. They're in serious sympathetic mode. Their cortisol levels are high and their reverse T3 is high because what they're trying to do is conserve so that they can survive the birth, right? So metabolism is low, body temperature is low, cortisol is high. These are the things that go on in the newborn. It's the stress response. Now, what's interesting is that during this conservation mode, what happens is that all the non-critical enzyme function is decreased. Underactive thyroid production, when you're in that conservation mode, what will happen is that you get things like dry skin and your eyes are dry and you have brittle nails. Those kinds of things happen because those enzymes are not critical for life. Whereas the essential enzymes, things like what will fuel your sympathetic reaction, your heart's got to be in good working order. Your skeletal muscles have to be ready to go. So that's all your muscles that make you move. So those enzymes are intact. Your vision, making sure that your acuity and how you're seeing things is working. Your hearing is maintained. And as I said, your cardiovascular or your heart and lung function is maintained as well, because that is critical for you to run away fast, okay, and get out of the situation. Now, this graph I've put together to really summarize how the whole temperature enzyme correlation works. And if you look at the continuum of temperature, we've got too cold, that's your body temperature on one side, and we've got too hot on the other side. Our normal temperature being 98.6 Fahrenheit or 37 Celsius. So that's our normal temperature, and that's just right. And at that temperature, that's where, if you think about enzymes like kind of a lock and a key, that's where the enzymes fit together perfectly and reactions can go on as normal. I should talk a little bit about enzymes so it'll give you an idea of exactly what enzymes do in the body. Every chemical reaction in our system needs an enzyme so that it goes on with less energy. It's like a catalyst. This is where I try to dredge up the information of your rudimentary chemistry, if there's any remembrance of those courses, where a reaction can go on with a certain amount of energy being needed to make that reaction going on. If there's a catalyst, you can still do the reaction, but at half or a third of the amount of energy that's needed. So with enzymes in the body, if you don't have that enzyme working properly, the reaction is going to take twice the energy or maybe even 3 times the energy. And what that really means, the energy that you have for the day, for your body working and having all of its functions, there's going to be less expendable energy for you to feel good, for you to have energy, for you to function in the way that you want to function. So enzymes are really critical to globally just how you feel. So as far as the enzymes being just right, when the temperature is normal, then we're able to function the way we should, and we should have good energy conservation so that we can do all the things that we want to. If the temperature is too cold, those enzymes are actually physically too tight and they can't actually fit in properly. So then enzymes can't lock in together and they're not functioning properly. Now also on the other side of things, and that's in example of hyperthyroidism, then what happens is that the enzymes are too far apart. They're sort of floating somewhere around here and they aren't in close enough proximity to get together and be able to affect the reaction in the way that they need to. So this is where this continuum of temperature can make such a difference. And even having a degree or 2 out on a regular basis can really make a big difference in how your body functions. Metabolism is really the sum of all the chemical reactions, but it does rely on enzyme functions to function properly. So let's look at the effects of the conservation mode. And, I laughed when I put the slide together because I thought, oh my God, it's so global. And this is the thing. Because we're talking about enzymes, that just about everything can be affected in your system. And it's very exhaustive, but you can see how there's an explanation for each of these in relationship to how the enzymes work. So we've got things like acid indigestion, Allergies, I'm meaning external allergies to trees and pollen and dust mites and those kinds of things. But also food intolerances you can actually have as a result of the thyroid not working properly. Because if you're in this conservation mode and you've stimulated cortisol, then what happens is that mucous membranes aren't functioning properly either. And that's where the food contacts the body, and that's how you can get more intolerances. Also, another aspect of that is that when cortisol is triggered, the immune system is triggered as well. So then you can actually start to get more sensitivities as a result of that hormonal imbalance. There's anxiety and depression. You can get muscular joints and aches and pains. Asthma, halitosis or bad breath can change. It has to do with liver not functioning properly. Increased bruising, that's also affected the liver. Carpal tunnel syndrome. Elevated cholesterol. Decreased wound healing. Irritable bowel syndrome, or you can have constipation. Dry eyes or blurred vision. Fatigue, fluid retention, food cravings, headaches and migraines, heat and cold intolerance. That's one that's typically seen as a thyroid type function because of its direct correlation to temperature. Hypoglycemia, and we talked about the effect of hyperinsulinemia and its effect with cortisol, but also low thyroid can be causing hypoglycemia. So it's kind of a double whammy. Recurrent affections because the immune system's not working properly. Insomnia, low blood pressure. And this one I see in countless females where they say, you know, I've been to my doctor and everything's okay because my blood pressure's low. But I always say, well, you know, how low is low? Because too low means you're not perfusing your tissues, not getting the good stuff to the tips of your fingers, and you're not getting the bad stuff out of it either. So too low blood pressure is not a good thing as well. Premenstrual syndrome becomes way worse with thyroid dysfunction. Increased postprandial response. And what that really means is that, you know, that sort of after holiday turkey feeling of that tryptophan rush where you just feel really sleepy? Well, that response can be exaggerated quite profoundly, even with small meals, when the thyroid's not functioning properly. It's also related to insulin and food intolerances because of this imbalance that we have with the glucose and the insulin, but the thyroid has another part to play in all of this. Psoriasis, decreased libido. Acne, and I mean sort of adult acne, you know, where you normally wouldn't have had acne, but now it's become a constant problem. And that really has to do with testosterone metabolites and how they're being held in the body. Abnormal swallowing sensations. This is one that I often find with people, is that they feel like either they've got a dry throat or they have to swallow all the time, or something funny is happening with their throat. And that's related to thyroid dysfunction. Tinnitus, so that's where you get the ringing in the ears. And weight gain, of course. Again, hypothyroidism and weight gain is really intricately related because it's related to thyroid function, temperature, and metabolism. Let's look at the tests for thyroid dysfunction. What do we actually do about this? How do we make a change, and what elements do we look at so that we can have a meaningful look at what actually is going on in the body? TSH is the gold standard for testing in the blood for thyroid, but this one is notoriously inaccurate because it's a very broad range to be really meaningful. And historically, when you look at how those normals were formed before lab tests, when they were just kind of starting up, what happened was they took a group of people who had no symptoms of thyroid problems and took their TSH levels. And then they had a whole bunch of other people that had TSH symptoms and took their TSH levels. And then that's where the broad spectrum was produced. It didn't have anything to do with an actual scientific connection between the symptoms and the test. So this is where, again, blood levels are much too broad to be meaningful. And I see that over and over and over again, where the TSH is normal, but there's tons of those symptoms going on with people. And so that's where I really look to the temperature as being the key for looking at thyroid function. Free T3 and T4 can be taken in the blood, but the problem with the blood in general is that it's a very static medium, that many changes can be happening at the cellular level before you see it in the blood. And that's because the blood is like our transportation ways. There's a lot happening locally before it actually makes a change in the blood. And the blood is very homeostatic. Everything needs to stay normal in the blood for the body to be happy. What I like to use is free T3 and T4 in the saliva, because saliva is a tissue and we're able to see exactly what's happening in the tissues. So we get to catch it when it's really early. Also, the very first thing that I have people do is to take their temperature, because it is really the most sensitive to the changes in your thyroid. And the great thing is that you can take it as many times as you want throughout the day, so you can actually get a good picture of how you rebound. Have some people who take their temperatures, and if they've been outside, their temperature is low for 3 or 4 hours. Now obviously their thyroid's not rebounding the way it should be. Or they're sitting beside a warm fire and their temperature is raised for a long period of time. So this again is showing me that there's some dysfunction and that there's not a quick response, because it's in that conservation mode. So again, as far as the treatment of thyroid dysfunction, what I like to do is to check the overall global endocrine function. So we're looking at adrenals, we're looking at insulin, looking at the reproductive hormones, and looking at the thyroid, so we can get a really big picture of what's going on entirely in the body. The problem may be coming from the adrenals. Now again, because it's the most critical endocrine organ as far as stress, then we need to look at treating that one. Also check your iodine status. If there's for some reason you're not getting enough iodine, this was changed in the early part of the century, where they started adding iodine to salt, refined salt. But now there's a lot of people who don't take in salt because of dietary restrictions, or it may be also that the mucous membranes aren't absorbing the iodine very well. So checking iodine status is really key. The first test, as I mentioned, that I really like to do is to get people to do a little bit of work at home, do their homework, and take their temperature 3, 6, and 9 hours after they wake up. The reason for that is that when you first wake up, all your stimulatory hormones from your HPA axis, your hypothalamic pituitary axis, is very active. And so your temperature tends to go up in the morning. And that's the one, if you're doing any fertility treatments or you're tracking your cycle, that's the temperature that you want to take so you can see if you're ovulating or not. But for our sake, because we're just looking at thyroid function, what we want to do is really just check it out throughout the day, but away from that time when you've just woken up. And what's really important about taking your temperature is that you take it with a liquid metal thermometer, because the digital thermometers are notoriously inaccurate. That you often see, I know this with my daughter when I'm checking her temperature, that you see variations in 0.2 or 0.4 degrees, and that's not acceptable. What we're looking for is a change in 0.1 or 0.2 or more, but we need to see those changes. And the great thing about a liquid metal temperature is that it will actually hold the temperature so you can look at it once you take it out of your mouth. So it's an oral temperature. If you could take it for 5 days, and it's not necessarily 5 consecutive days, you can get it on a work day, a weekend day, different levels of stress, and you can see how stress can affect your thyroid production. Also, the other thing is, for cycling women, make sure you don't take your temperature on day 1, 2, and 3, or 3 days before your period starts. So at the end of your cycle as well, if they're predictable. I know that end one is always a hard one to do, but if you can make sure you don't do it at the beginning of your cycle, then it's more useful. Also with thyroid dysfunction, it's very important to support proper kidney, liver, and digestive function. Now this, I feel, is a very big part of constitutional therapy, where we're trying to support our primary elimination organs so that they can work so much more efficiently to help balance the body in so many ways. So especially because the thyroid, active thyroid hormone T3 is produced in the liver, we need to make sure our liver health is really quite good. And liver health is also dependent on GI health because of the constipation factor. Let's look at herbal treatments. Because the adrenals are such a big part of this, I always recommend adaptogens, herbs that help with adrenal health, and those are things like borage and ashwagandha. Those are some really good adrenal tonics. Herbs that help with liver function to help improve the extraction of toxins from the liver into the bile are things like artichoke and dandelion, specifically the dandelion root. Also, a very specific thyroid treatment is the use of bladderwrack. Kelps are a wonderful source of many minerals, but specifically bladderwrack is a kelp that's found locally that is half of the T4 molecule. So depending on what your problem is, if it's a problem with T4 production in the thyroid, then using something like bladderwrack is excellent, because what it does is it helps to give you half of the T4 molecule. Then all the thyroid has to do is put the two together, and it's a very easy synthetic route, even in conservation mode. Now, T4 is only a part of the picture. We said iodine, making sure you're getting enough iodine, which bladderwrack will provide, and also making sure that your liver is working properly so that you're having that conversion into T3. In cases where there's mild changes in temperature, I'll use more generalized sea vegetables. And sea vegetables are usually a combination of brown and red kelps and have an overall nutritive effect on the body. They really provide iodine amongst all the other trace minerals and really will immediately help with skin and hair and nails and energy in general, if there isn't a very large problem with the thyroid being in that conservation mode. Now, if the thyroid is stuck in conservation mode, there's a bunch of different therapies. There's one called Wilson's temperature syndrome, by which control-release T3 is given in increased dosages until the person reaches the proper temperature, and then it's withdrawn. It's a fairly complicated protocol, but works really well to help reset that thyroid. Because often what happens is that the thyroid, even though the stress is removed, the thyroid doesn't have the ability to get out of conservation mode. So this is a really important part. But if it's also stuck in conservation mode, the reason may be that the immune system has now gotten involved in the process. What often happens is that with dysfunction for a long period of time, the body starts producing immunoglobulins against that hormone and that organ. And so what we attempt to do is use things called Proto Morphogens, which help to remove those immunoglobulins from the receptors, so then the nutrients can get into the cell and the body can start working better. This is particularly useful in autoimmune-mediated thyroid dysfunction. And in the absence of the use of kelps, that's where a bioavailable iodine would be really useful to be able to replenish the body of iodine if there is a deficiency. Now, because the immune system, the endocrine system, and the nervous system are all in harmony together and they have feedback loops to work in harmony with each other, it's very important that we support proper immune function. This is done with immune modulators like echinacea or astragalus or any of the medicinal mushrooms. As far as nervous system support goes, the B vitamins, nutritional yeast being an example, is important. Essential fatty acids, particularly DHA, is an important one for nervous system, and relaxing nervines like wild oats or passion flower or skullcap. And as with any other holistic therapy, I always like to talk about whole foods and using whole foods and where we need to go with our diet to be able to improve our health. And one of the key things that I find is that people are often very deficient in their vegetables, even though they may have a very good diet as far as lots of fruits, lots of vegetables. They don't have a lot of processed foods, not a lot of frozen foods, but they're really deficient in their vegetables because it's very hard to get the amount of vegetables that we need throughout the day. And our vegetables are really our best source of vitamins and minerals and fiber. So what I suggest is if you can get some vegetable juices and juice them 8 to 12 cups a day if you're in a real critical healing state that you need those nutrients, or if you're kind of in maintenance that you're just doing 2 or 3 cups a day is something really great to do for your body. Water, drinking water is a really important part of health. Making sure you take water in the form of spring water. I'm a big believer in spring water versus distilled water, simply because distilled water's taken all of the nutrients out of it. All the trace minerals are gone. So the water isn't absorbed as well. So if you can get good spring water that doesn't have heavy metals in it, make sure you're looking at the analysis, then that's the best way to go as far as water. And manual therapies, visualizing your health, and high nutrients digestible foods is always recommended. So I hope that I've given you some sort of guidelines to just give you a little look into what happens with the thyroid in relationship to adrenal health, how it affects insulin and the rest of the endocrine organs, and then some ways to be able to bring that organ back into health again.